welcome to this special Fabian Society event, Budget 2021, The Verdict. For those of you who I don't know, my name's Andrew Harrop. I'm the General Secretary of the Fabian Society, and it's our pleasure to be joined by Labour's Shadow Chancellor, Anneliese Dodds, also, of course, a member of the Fabian Society's Executive Committee, and we've been delighted to be working with Anneliese over the almost a year since she's been Labour's Shadow Chancellor. But perhaps this is the most important moment for her in shadowing the Treasury brief since she's been in post. The first budget that we've seen since Keir Starmer became leader of the Labour Party. And we've got a full hour with Anneliese to analyse and interrogate all those really important decisions that were announced by the Chancellor yesterday. We're going to start with about 25-30 minutes of discussion between myself and Anneliese, and then we'll have plenty of time for question and answers from all of you as well once we have had that initial discussion. And you can ask those questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. Go ahead and type in your questions from any time from now, and we'll pick a selection of them once Anneliese and I have spent a few minutes in conversation. The budget yesterday obviously was a major economic event. With the COVID crisis still not resolved, the Chancellor announced major spending to protect people's well-being and livelihoods over the next 6 months. But he also announced the largest set of tax increases since 1993, billions and billions of tax rises, but not to come for 2 years. It was also, in the small print, a pretty bad budget for lots of reasons that are held dear by Fabian members and Labour Party members. In our reaction to the budget, we said it was bad news for low-income families, bad news for public services, and bad news for affordable housing. So although there were some things that I'm sure Anneliese will want to welcome in the budget yesterday, there's an awful lot of detail that needs to be unpicked. So to begin, Anneliese, could I just sort of ask you, first of all, to give us a feel for your overall verdict on the budget yesterday?
Absolutely, and it's so good to be here. Oh, good, we've got rid of the echo, fabulous. Or I think we have. Yeah, we have, good. Yeah, really good to be with you all today, and thanks very much indeed, Andy, and to the Fabian Society for hosting this event. Thanks to everyone who's joined us. I think one of the most significant developments yesterday was actually within the OBR's papers, the Office for Budget Responsibilities papers, where they set out the fact that the UK has experienced the worst economic crisis of any major economy. Obviously, the government has tried to suggest that assessment previously was down to different methods of analysing economic activity. Well, the OBR said, look, even when you take that into account, the UK still had the worst economic crisis of any country in the G7. And the OBR explicitly linked that to what's happened in our country with coronavirus, the fact we've had high levels of infection, high levels of hospitalisation, that we've had lockdowns which have lasted for longer, which have been more intense than in other countries, more restrictive than in other countries. And we know why that's happened. That's happened because of government failures, quite often, unfortunately, the Chancellor's failures to appreciate that we needed to act speedily against this disease. In particular, the Chancellor's blocking of a circuit break, of course, last autumn. That would have been for a shorter period. It would have covered the half term, so it would have been more effective. Also, his failure still to face up to the need to fix the system for self-isolation, with only 3 in 10 people in the UK who are required to self-isolate reporting that they actually do. We desperately needed a reset of the system for self-isolation. What did we get in the budget? We actually got a reduction in real terms in sick pay in subsequent years. I mean, completely the opposite of where we should be during a pandemic. So that was really significant, I think, coming from the OBR as the context for this budget. Given that, we needed a budget which would set us on the road to recovery. We needed a budget that would protect family incomes, that would build the jobs of the future and that would promote the resilience of our public services. But, you know, as Andy intimated, and I agree with the Fabian's analysis, this budget is not delivering that, unfortunately. On household finances, the Chancellor is still ploughing ahead with those really major increases in council tax, 5%, which will have a huge impact on families up and down the country. Of course, they're still also persisting with their squeeze on public sector pay, hitting some people who normally wouldn't be viewed as well paid, you know, teaching assistants, police officers, members of the armed forces, again up and down the country. And then, although the Chancellor's increased the time period where that £20 uplift for universal credit will be in place, he's saying he's going to switch it off exactly when we expect that the big bump in unemployment is likely to be coming through. So the wrong measures for protecting household finances. Secondly, on building those new jobs of the future, I think we were all waiting, we're all sat in the House of Commons or watching on television, waiting for the Chancellor to make an announcement about support for new jobs, but he never made it, unfortunately. He didn't say what he would do to fix the Kickstart and Restart schemes. You know, Labour's demonstrated how we could provide a real guarantee of support, a guarantee of a job, training or education to young people after 6 months, a guarantee of support also for the long-term unemployed who aren't fitting into that bracket of young people after 12 months. Chancellor did not do that, unfortunately, yesterday. He didn't say anything about fixing those schemes, but he also didn't back those jobs of the future, particularly green jobs of the future. We know the government's previously announced flagship scheme, the Green Homes Grant, it's actually losing jobs. Chancellor made no mention of that yesterday. Instead, if he was pulling forward capital spending in the way that Labour's advocated, we said that we could generate up to 400,000 additional jobs being created by businesses up and down the country, also by charities and others, if we had that strong focus. Didn't see it again from government. And then finally, the aspect that has received quite rightly a lot of negative comments from economists, from health experts and others, is the fact that the Chancellor has projected that in future years we'll actually see a reduction in public spending across a whole range of areas, including our NHS. And it is simply not credible to have a Chancellor saying that he's going to be honest and level with the public, and then him pretend the next moment in the small print that our NHS deserves less funding in future years than what it was anticipated to have before this pandemic hit. We know there's going to be a big backlog hitting our NHS after this COVID crisis. The Chancellor should have faced up to that, made sensible projections for NHS spend into the future. He didn't do that in this budget, and he should have been seeking to rebuild the foundations of our economy during this budget. Instead, we had a budget that just papered over the cracks, I'm afraid.
Anneliese, thanks so much for that set of opening remarks. And there's so much that we want to get into the detail on. Let's start with, if you like, the next year or 18 months and think about the recovery. Now, obviously, the furlough scheme has been very important, and the self-employment scheme when people can't work. But there's the period from, let's all hope, things are more or less back to normal by the summer, but the next year following that is going to be a very shaky time. And I'd really like to get into the detail of whether you think the announcements to support the economy during that period were the right ones, and whether there is enough of them. Today, the IFS said that the Chancellor had been quite generous in his support for the economy, but other commentators have disagreed. So, for example, the IPPR made the comparison with Joe Biden's plans in America and said that this was a timid approach to stimulus. What do you think about both the detail of the support, but also the overall magnitude of support for once we're coming out of lockdown and trying to get back to economic normality?
You didn't have to say the most offsaid phrase in the whole world right now, Andy, which is your music. Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, that the big question is really about whether existing spending is going into the right places. And we've seen, and obviously I'm sure people on this call will have seen, we've said repeatedly that actually government must crack down on the waste and mismanagement and poor targeting that we've seen through this crisis. We're not talking about small amounts of money here. £22 billion going to a test and trace system that didn't work effectively for months, all the scandals around contracts that we've seen, but also now measures being put in place that are just not targeted. So you look at the business rates holiday, for example. Now, of course, we'd called for its extension. I mean, we would say that the Chancellor took too long to provide that certainty around extending the business rates holiday, and many businesses will have thrown in the towel, business owners in the interim. But actually that extension, we would argue and did argue, should have been targeted. If you look at Welsh Labour's approach, they said that, for example, the very biggest essential retailers shouldn't be benefiting from the business rates linked support to the extent of smaller firms, those small family run businesses that they've focused their support on. So we should have seen it more targeted. We shouldn't have seen that blanket stamp duty holiday continued for second homeowners. Again, that wasn't done in Labour run Wales. They had a more targeted approach. So first, we've got to have more targeting in the system to better support people. When it comes to the furlough scheme, we wanted to see an extension of that scheme. We wanted a commitment from the Chancellor that it would be available for as long as health restrictions are in place and there's a heavy impact on demand. And actually the Chancellor didn't say that. And of course, we all hope that we will be out of restrictions when it comes to September. But there are fears that unless government gets a grip on this crisis properly into the future, that we could see, for example, localised restrictions being put into place again. If the Chancellor had been clear that he would maintain that support for businesses in heavily impacted areas while there are restrictions, that would have provided more certainty and security. That would have helped to build confidence. And that's, of course, the big problem for the UK economy right now, that we're really lacking that confidence going forward. But then, of course, there's that big question about the jobs of the future, support for people who are already unemployed. And here government just seems to be pushing so much of this back and back. The Restart scheme, for example, it's been anticipated that it's not going to be up to full steam for between 12 and 18 months. Well, by that point, the big peak in unemployment is likely to have passed. We said instead, please accelerate these schemes. We set out how government could do that. We did that, I think it was last weekend. Johnny Reynolds, Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, working with the Shadow Treasury team, we set out how we could deliver that guarantee of support and how we could do so speedily so that those who are unemployed now would get the help they needed. And it's not just important for those individuals. This is really important for our economy, because if people have spent a long period unemployed, we see the impact of that on their lifetime earnings, up to 20% less income for people who spent a long time when they were young being unemployed. We need to avoid that with much stronger measures now.
The Chancellor's assumptions about what his tax and spend plans will look like were really depended on employment and growth really picking up from the end of this year. How did you feel when he announced those numbers? I mean, he's assuming that unemployment peaks at a level far lower than previous serious recessions, even though it's been such a terrible economic crisis. And if that doesn't happen, that's obviously terrible for the people affected, but it also means that the economy over the medium term will struggle and the public finances will be wrecked.
Yeah, I mean, we all, of course, hope that we will see a strong recovery coming through. And I suppose to an extent, it is difficult to make those comparisons with previous economic crises, because obviously a lot of economic activity has just been completely stopped. It's been stopped by government fiat rather than stopping for other reasons. For example, like the aftermath we saw of the financial crisis, and of course, previous to that, the credit crunch. So this is a different kind of crisis. Nonetheless, I think you're right, Andy, to say that government shouldn't be really pinning all of its hopes on a particular escape route, I suppose, from this crisis. And I would say that's particularly the case when they've continually seemed to focus on what they hope will be a big boom from savers releasing their funds and spending. Now, of course, we want people to go out and start spending. It's going to be really, really important that people do that. But we also know more people have lost incomes during this crisis, or lost income during this crisis, than have been able to build up those savings. But we also know from figures, surveys undertaken by the Bank of England, for example, and others, that most people who have saved have not said that they're going to be immediately spending that money. Some projections suggesting that they would be likely to only spend about 5% of it. The rest of it, they're wanting to keep in savings of some form. You know, quite a bit of evidence. A lot of that's going into property, and that's not a sensible place actually, really, for those savings to be parked. That's why we put forward our recovery bonds proposal. It means for people to have, you know, a longer term safe place to put their money, not a place where they would be earning super returns beyond what they would otherwise be getting, but where they could be contributing, you know, building on that national spirit to our country's future and linking that to capitalising the National Infrastructure Bank. Government should be adopting that kind of a more long-term approach rather than pinning so many hopes on what seems like, you know, quite a risky possibility around really pushing that spending through out of savings.
And one group who won't be spending more are the 6 million low-income families who are going to be seeing a big cut in their income of £1,000 a year when the universal credit and working tax credit uplift ends. What would Labour have done differently to support family finances? And we're talking about people out of work, but we're just also talking about low-income families. Almost half of children are affected by this cut. What would you do differently, Anneliese?
Well, a number of things. And I would say that when it comes to universal credit, obviously the only problem with that scheme is not whether or not it has that £20 uplift. I mean, we support that being continued beyond what the government has set out. We think it should be continued for as long as it takes until we get to that fairer, more effective system of social security that we really need, and the one that Labour would put into place. But it's not just, as I said, about that £20 uplift. It's also about, you know, the 5-week wait, the fact that you can only get loan-based support after 2 weeks. That's pushing a lot of people into debt, many of them for the first time who've lost their job and have high costs. It's the fact that also there's that cap on families when it comes to universal credit and the benefit system. So bad for many families who've got children with, we have large families basically and in high cost areas, big problem for them. But I would say, of course, it's not just about universal credit. I'm not suggesting you said that it was, Andy, but we've got those big issues with other benefit systems as well. On working tax credits, there's a strange approach from the government actually, when the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions previously said that a lump sum wouldn't be the way to go for universal credit. I mean, we agreed with her around that actually more regular payments makes much more sense. But then that's what they put in place for working tax credits, for the £500 lump sum there, and no action taken for disability related benefits. And actually, obviously, the costs for people, particularly those with multiple needs, for example, people who are needing to stay at home, people who might be having to shield, who are reliant on disability related benefits, their costs have gone up really substantially, but their income hasn't been in pace at all. So we said that uplift should be reflected in other benefits as well, and legacy benefits too. We think that's really important for protecting people's living standards.
Great. So, Anneliese, let's talk about the tax rises that were announced yesterday. So, two big ones and then some smaller as well. But the freezing of thresholds, which is broadly speaking a progressive rise, although, you know, perhaps there are other options a Labour team might have chosen, and the increasing corporation tax, which was in Labour's last manifesto. So do you feel you can positively support those moves, or do you feel that Labour should be opposing what is the largest tax rise for more than 25 years? And what does it mean for Labour's strategy going in towards the next election? Because, you know, at the last election, we were able to say we would raise spending on priority areas, partly because of that corporation tax rise. It does mean that if we need to say we want to spend more in future, we'll have to find new ways of saying we can pay for it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if I kind of pull out the different elements of what was announced yesterday, because ultimately, I think there are quite different dynamics at play with all of them. I mean, we said for some time that, right now is not the time to be imposing additional taxes. And actually, of course, I mean, you didn't mention council tax, but of course that's happening right now. That's going to be taking place this financial year that we're looking into right now, impacting on families now, 5% increase and an increasingly regressive tax. So that change is already happening. We obviously heard the rumours that were floating around on both corporation tax and a freezing of personal allowances. And we were really concerned that government might be seeking to impose those immediately from the next financial year. That would have been the wrong decision. That would have been flying in the face of what not just Labour was saying, but also the OECD, the IMF, all of those expert organisations saying that now is the time when government should be focused on building the recovery rather than on imposing additional taxes. First, when it comes to corporation tax, I mean, this is really quite a handbrake style turn from the Conservatives. We've had 10 years when they've sought to cut back the rates of corporation tax. They said that would lead to investment growth. It hasn't. Actually, the UK's bumped along the bottom compared to other G7 countries on investment growth. And now they've obviously had to make a correction in future years. The problem is, of course, it's really expensive for them to do it this way. That's why they've got to shove in that enormous investment brake, because otherwise businesses would push back investment so they could count it against that higher rate of corporation tax coming in at the end of the period. So it's a really expensive way of doing it. It just shows why that short-termist approach to taxes really doesn't make sense. Now, when it comes to the freezing of thresholds, I mean, you're right that, traditionally the biggest positive impact of having thresholds rise has been for those who've earned the most. That is the case. That's clear from the data. But equally, we're very well aware of the fact that this is taking place at the same time. So there are many different pressures on families. While we're seeing that increase in, of course, council tax that's likely to be carried forward into the future, while we've seen the squeeze on public sector pay, while we may well be seeing wage stagnation as well. So really, we've said to government, look, we want to understand how this is going to interact with those other pressures on people's incomes. We want to ensure that ultimately low and middle income people are protected during this crisis. We think that's very important. And before we get into those tax issues, the reason why it seems the Chancellor is focused on some of this now is because, and he's not made any secret of this, it's been reported in the press and he hasn't denied it, because he wants to get tax changes out relatively early compared to other countries so he can then cut taxes back before the next general election. That's not being driven by the economic cycle, it's being driven by the electoral cycle, as Keir said yesterday, and he was absolutely right.
And on the subject of the electoral cycle, there were some eyebrow-raising announcements with some of the spending plans, particularly around the Towns Fund and the Levelling Up initiatives, which felt nakedly party political in terms of the allocation of money. And in some of those communities, we were seeing at the same time, the cuts to universal credit or the impact of council tax that wasn't being discussed, but actually will have a negative impact on just those places that are getting their sort of high-profile, piece of investment often associated with their local Conservative MP, which feels borderline corrupt in ways. At the same time, there were also plans across the public services which weren't talked about in his speech at all for major cuts. And they will affect, of course, they'll affect the NHS and education, but perhaps more so those lower profile areas that have been basically suffering from austerity ever since 2010. How will you go about sort of making the arguments on spending, public services and levelling up as well to show that the Conservatives are sometimes offering less than they appear to, but also to try and win the political battles? Because undoubtedly, Tory MPs in marginal seats will have more to sell than they did before budget day.
Well, I think really, first of all, we've got to be very clear that the rhetoric is simply not matching the reality. If you look at infrastructure, for example, we've seen announcements or re-announcements of major rail projects in the north 60 times. So 60 different announcements and re-announcements, and not a single spade in the ground on any of those major projects. So there's a huge gulf between rhetoric and reality there. And actually the inequalities that exist have worsened during this crisis. You know, people in the north have been more likely to be made unemployed during this crisis, holding everything else equal. There have been many impacts as well on people's quality of life. You know, people again in the north more likely to suffer from mental ill health, holding everything else equal during this crisis than those in the rest of the UK. So there have been big inequalities revealed through this crisis. And just as you set out, Andy, what the government is doing to public services will make that worse. And much of what they've announced is not even going to be making up the difference. If you look at, for example, Treasury for the North, the number of additional jobs that will generate is actually a tenth of the number of civil service jobs that have been lost to the region under Conservative-led government. So there's a huge gulf there. I think going forward, you know, it's really important that we as Labour show that we have the vision for local areas, both to deliver the infrastructure that's needed, those concrete projects, but above all, to make sure we do so in a way that improves people's living standards. So using local companies, employing local people, delivering local apprenticeships, the way that the government is delivering this new infrastructure is stripping any controls around that kind of thing away. It's stripping it away from mayoral authorities, from the Welsh government and from the Scottish government, not allowing them to put social value, so-called conditions on to those kinds of projects. Is absolutely the wrong approach. And we really shouldn't be seeing, you know, different towns being pitted against each other to fight for resources coming from ministers in Whitehall. We need to see a much more joined up approach that really focuses on driving up people's living standards right across the country.
Just before I turn to the delegates on the call, let me ask you, Anneliese, what's it like opposing Rishi Sunak when you're seeing a chancellor who seems more worried about his future career than perhaps, you know, getting the right decisions for low-income families?
Well, I have to say it is frustrating, I think, particularly when obviously we've been through a terrible time as a country, but we've also seen our incredible promise as well. You know, the success of the vaccination programme, and I know that's down to NHS staff, to GPs and their staff and volunteers and local authorities all pulling together, delivering that. Actually, it's not been to do with central government, but that shows we've got that incredible promise. Again, the ventilator challenge showing our industrial capacity when we do things right. And I want to see a chancellor who's focused on that, who's focused on recovering our economy, building up people's living standards, protecting households, not focused on political considerations. And I think, you know, that whole debate around tax really brings it home when you seem to have a chancellor saying to his backbenchers, look, don't worry about this. Yes, we'll see an increase in tax. For example, that increase in council tax, maybe he was talking about, we'll see an increase in tax. We'll do that now to get the pain out of the way so we can cut this again and have a good run at the next general election, when every single economic expert says that's the wrong thing to do for our economy. Of course, that's really frustrating, and he's got to change course and really get the right priorities in mind.
Great. And so we'll turn to our participants. So we're going to try and bring you in to ask your own questions. You'll know that Zoom isn't entirely reliable on this. So if it doesn't work out, I'll read out what you've asked. If a couple of people are raising their hands, so we're not doing hand raising, so please put your question into the Q&A. I'm going to start with two slightly related questions from Michael Corcoran and Martin Plout. So Michael, do you want to ask your question first?
Good afternoon, Anneliese. Right, it goes after this fashion. I'll read it. Can we educate the electorate to take an informed view of the significance of the national debt? In brackets, not a debt, but an opportunity for savers to make safe investments. Huge public investment will be needed to meet the challenge of climate change of a scale that will dwarf that which has gone into deal with the pandemic. There is effectively no risk of interest rates causing a problem, as others would suggest, unless and until full employment threatens a workforce shortage.
Great. And then Martin Plout, you had a question on debt as well.
Yes, my question is this. Obviously, it's you have different spending priorities, but at what point do you see debt as unsustainable? And more importantly, how do you think you would get debt down?
So two slightly different takes on debt, Anneliese. So yes, if you could feel your way between those two questions, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely, and really interestingly different, actually, as is always the case with the Fabians. So yeah, really, really good questions. I mean, first of all, Michael, I would say that I don't think we can be blasé about the potential for interest rate increases in the future. I don't think this is a particular near possibility, but I wouldn't say that it will never happen. I don't think that is a sensible way, personally, of looking at this. I think it's unlikely that we would see, for example, inflation occurring through so-called wage push inflation, so that we would see the transmission mechanism operating in that way. If we were talking kind of 30 years ago, that might have been the discussion, but obviously we've had really, really slow growth in wages over the last 10 years. There's a lot of space, I think, for people's incomes to improve before we would be getting into those kinds of woods. I would say, though, that it is always possible that we could see increases in inflation from other routes. I think there's far more chance of that in the US than there is here. But if we saw, for example, severe disruptions to supply, it's possible that could result probably in short-term impacts. But I wouldn't discount it completely. I do think that we need to be aware of that always. But we do need to have really an informed position around public finances going forward. I would say a much longer term perspective on them than we've had in recent years. And I guess this relates a little bit to Martin's question, because actually over the last 10 years, we saw the overall stock of UK debt increasing from about 1 trillion to about 1.8 trillion. That was before we went into the current crisis. Obviously, it's increased substantially since then, but we saw that taking place whilst we had Conservative-led governments setting themselves different fiscal targets, legally binding targets, every single one of which they missed, right? So they met one of the ones that they set themselves most recently. It wasn't a legally binding one, but all the previous legally binding ones they missed. So they completely failed by their own measures of success. Why did that happen? And I kind of set this out in more detail in a lecture that I gave at the beginning of the year. I think one of the major reasons why is because they simply were not looking to the future. They weren't identifying the reasons why we hadn't seen the kind of sustained inclusive growth that we needed to see right across the country. So they hadn't focused, for example, on the resilience of our public services. We know that not having that has been a major issue during this crisis. They hadn't focused on improving productivity to the extent that they should have done up and down the country. So we saw those gaps, those regional gaps in the extent of productivity growth increasing over time under Conservative-led governments, rather than those gaps reducing over time. So we need to have a longer term perspective. That means, for example, taking account of the stock of public sector net wealth into the future, which these government targets haven't done previously. Also means investing for the future as well. Finally, the Conservatives seem to have got a little bit of the message around that rhetorically, but they're not delivering it in practice, because actually their capital spending, it's astonishing, their capital spending is actually going down next year compared to what they previously budgeted for. The complete opposite from what just about every other country is doing. And that does relate, of course, to Michael's point about climate change, because we do see in other countries that real focus on a green stimulus, one which is a win-win, delivering jobs up and down different countries, at the same time as helping with net zero requirements. For example, if we had a major retrofitting programme, that would be a win-win for our environment and for our economy and for employment, not being adopted by the UK government now when it should be.
Thanks, Anneliese. I'd like to bring in Alexandra Sufit. If you can switch yourself on, Alexandra.
Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed. So my question was effectively on women who have undeniably suffered during the pandemic. There's a lot of evidence out there taking on the share of childcare, being rejected in very large numbers for furlough, according to the TUC survey. Also working in sectors hard hit like retail, hospitality, early years, frontline workers, the list goes on. I wanted to ask, if this were a Labour budget, what would you be tackling? How would you tackle those inequalities? I mean, it's nothing new, as we all know, but I think COVID and the pandemic has very much shone a spotlight on it. Thank you.
And I also, thanks, Alexandra. I also want to bring in Stephen Morton. Hi, Stephen, are you there?
Hello there, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, thank you very much indeed for organising this, Andrew, and Anneliese for presenting this really interesting session. It's on the matter of affordable housing. Now, the Conservatives persistently have applied demand-side solutions to what is ultimately a supply-side problem. So what we get happening is that demand for housing consistently rises, pushing up prices and making housing ever more unaffordable. Two questions, if I may. Why isn't this approach challenged more explicitly by Labour? And secondly, what strategies are Labour developing to overcome the problem of unaffordability?
And then a question from Timothy Sykes, and we'll go back to Anneliese after that.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is, I am a teacher or a trainee teacher, and one of the things that the budget did not cover was wage rises for the public sector. The government has obviously frozen wages for teachers and local government workers. This has been announced separately earlier, but there have been promises from the Conservative Party to trainee teachers about wage increases over the following few years to 2030. They have promised wages to be at a minimum £30,000. So what I want to know is, as an opposition, how are you going to really hand it to the government and make it very, very clear that they have to follow these promises? Because we've had 10 years of austerity and wage caps. We don't want another 10 years. Sorry, I get really angry about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Timothy. So Anneliese, three big questions there. Over to you.
Yeah, maybe if I start with Timothy's question, because I think you're right to be angry, to be completely honest. We did have that commitment from the Conservatives before. I seem to remember it may even have been a manifesto commitment, actually, that they stated there would be that support for salaries for those coming into the teaching profession. And yet, as you say, we have seen that public sector pay freeze. And I think government is trying to suggest there's some kind of big gulf between public and private sector workers here. The reality simply doesn't indicate that at all. You know, it's at a rally a couple of nights ago with the TUC. Is very, very clear that actually this strategy of kind of divide and rule simply is not washing with people, because they know the situation. Government's tried to say, oh, it's only those above £24,000 who will be impacted by the public sector pay freeze. In fact, I had exactly that same claim made to me this morning. Simply not right. Actually, all of those earning above £18,000 will be receiving a real termed pay freeze, because there's just a lump sum for those between 18k and 24 of, I think it's £250. It's not amounting to that increase that they say is going to be there in real wages at all. What have we done around this? Well, we've continually tried to show the impact of this, not just on those individuals and their families, but also on recruitment, where it's likely that, you know, having these kinds of constrained wages will have that negative impact. Also, for example, in policing, where government struggled actually around some of its recruitment targets, where these kind of pay squeezes are really not going to be helping. But then also on local economies, because, you know, who is it who's going to be going into local shops, local restaurants, using local cafes, you know, buying their kids clothes and this kind of thing? It's actually a lot of the time those public sector workers who are going to be hit by these pay freezes. It's completely economically illiterate, as well as, going along with that council tax rise the government is putting into place and the cut to universal credit, not what should be done right now. Alexandra's point, I think, first of all, what we need to do is measure the impact of our measures on different groups. And that is something this government has signally refused to do. They refuse to provide an equality impact assessment alongside their budgets and other economic interventions. That's completely unacceptable. In previous budgets, actually, they provided a little annex which showed, they said, the positive impact of their measures on different groups with protected characteristics, didn't show any of the negative ones. So it wasn't actually an impact assessment, but they didn't even seem to bother with that this time. So we had no indication of the impact of their measures on women. And it really has been a tough time. Bridget Phillipson, who works with me, brilliant Shadow Chief Secretary, she's called this a she session, because when you look at the impact on women, as you said, those who've been furloughed, those who haven't been furloughed, those who've seen their incomes dropping, those who have low employment prospects for the future. So often it's women, particularly actually young women in many parts of the country. How would we do differently? Well, we'd be open about the impact of our measures, but in addition, we would act, for example, around the fact that employers aren't furloughing people who've got caring responsibilities. I wrote to the Chancellor about this, asked him for a meeting on it. He refused to meet with me to discuss this issue. We also would be ensuring that the needs of parents, and I know that not all women are parents, and of course many are parents as well, but we would make sure that they were considered from the beginning. I mean, there was actually more guidance in some of the government's documents about restrictions on how to play tennis than there was guidance for parents of school-aged children when the kids got sent home from school. And the government only very recently said that they would extend the self-isolation payment to parents of children sent home from school, as Labour has been calling for months and months and months. Of course, in the longer term, Alexandra, we need to do far more to make sure that particularly poverty pay is dealt with. And so often that's a problem for women. We need to be making sure that we have much fairer employment in sectors like social care as well, where obviously there's a lot of female employment concentrated. But in the near term, we need to do far more for those women who are really struggling with this pandemic. Stephen, you're absolutely right. And actually, I think Labour has been very explicit about this. If you see, for example, our response to what the Prime Minister suggested last weekend was going to be somehow answering the challenges of generation rent. He said that his measure of 95% mortgages, that this was going to be creating generation buy. My goodness, that was falling far short of any such claims. Of course, that approach will help a bit. It will help some people, maybe about 3,000 a month who are seeking a mortgage. But actually the impact of this, given constrained supply, as you rightly point out, Stephen, is likely to be just an increase in prices, when actually what we need is that additional supply, that genuinely affordable additional supply. Where should it come from? Well, we've set out a number of ways in which the system must change in order to deliver it. Thangam Debonair, our Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, has talked about this a lot. We need to change the planning system. Currently, all the rules around viability are in the hands of the developer. We need to be actually giving communities more control around this. The government's answer to housing supply seems to be to say, well, you can just shift commercial units into supply. That's likely to result in what some of the government's own advisors have called modern day slums. That's not the kind of housing that we need for the future. And of course, we do need to be building those genuinely affordable homes, including council homes, as Keir rightly called for in the budget debate. So lots to be done there. And as you say, Stephen, focusing just on the supply side and having nothing to, sorry, the other way around, focusing just on the demand side and having nothing to say about the supply side is absolutely the wrong approach.
Thanks, Anneliese. Let me go to Liz Hines, and then after Liz, I'll go to Maurice Austin and then Peter Burt. Liz Hines. Hi, Liz.
Hi, Andy. Hi, Anneliese. So unsurprisingly, my question is about pubs and the hospitality, and with that, the leisure sector as well. I mean, it was really nice to hear Keir acknowledge just how much debt we're in at the moment. So, I mean, are we facing another year of crisis in the sector as consumer confidence is low. You look at polls done by Ipsos Mori, and I'm not expecting to have a full pub this summer. So we're laden with debt, and we're going to have to start contributing to furlough. And furlough when you are a closed business is not business support, it's a business cost. And we've still done the right thing and got staff on furlough. So are we facing another crisis for hospitality and leisure this year?
Thanks, Liz. Maurice, you have 2 questions. Just your short question, please.
Hello.
Hi, Maurice.
Hello. Thanks for that. My comments about duties on fuel, alcohol, and so on, which have been frozen again.
Sorry, can I ask you to ask your other question? You had a question about pensions.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. Well, my other question is very, very simple. What is the Labour Party's approach to the pension triple lock, please?
One of the most expensive areas of public funding. Peter, you have a good question. Are you on the call, Peter? No, I will read it out then. So Peter says, first of all, he says, your interview on the Stay programme was good, but just like Sir Keir, you said nothing about the many businesses, performers and others that have been hit, often fatally, by the government's cruel ideology-driven Brexit. Is it now Labour policy to pretend Brexit isn't happening? Anneliese, back to you.
Great, thanks ever so much, everybody. Maybe first of all with Liz's question, and thanks very much, Liz, for all the campaigning that you do on behalf of pubs, and indeed for all that you've been doing with your own staff. I know it's been a really, really hard time. I mean, my concern is that actually the government seems to be assuming that everything will immediately be turning back to normal when their roadmap is run through. But I don't see in that roadmap actually, for example, complete removal of the kind of space requirements that were put in place before. We may well see some continuation of restrictions like those into the future. Now, obviously, with low margin businesses like pubs, that's going to mean that, it's a difference between being able to operate to a profit compared to operating to a loss. And so I do think that issue, as you mentioned about debt, is really fundamental, because government had nothing to say on this. The Chancellor said nothing about it during his speech yesterday. They've created a new loan scheme, and obviously there will be some businesses who need to take on additional debt now. But actually, when I talk to particularly small businesses, their biggest concern is the debt that they have already taken on. That's why Labour said we needed to have a smart approach to this. We needed for small businesses to allow them to pay back that debt once they were into profit. So genuine pay-as-you-grow, not the Chancellor's fake pay-as-you-grow, because it's not, it's just extending repayment terms. Ours would be genuine pay-as-you-grow. But then for bigger companies, saying to them, let's have a creative approach to dealing with this loan debt. Let's, for example, enable employees to have a stake in businesses. Let's enable preference shares within businesses to alleviate that debt burden, so that businesses can then be looking not just to get back into operation, but ideally to be taking on new staff into the future, to be growing jobs into the future. Maurice, your question about the pension triple lock, well, of course, that's a manifesto commitment from the government, one that we will very much be holding them to. And actually, this has been such a hard period for so many older people during this crisis. Really, really difficult for a lot of people. Obviously, costs going up in terms of fuel, etc., people spending longer at home. It really is important that we ensure that people's incomes are maintained. And then the last question, I mean, we absolutely haven't been in any way shying away from pointing out the problems with the Brexit deal. Keir was very clear about this in his speech yesterday to the Chancellor. It's extraordinary that we have a government in place now which didn't mention Brexit once. The Chancellor didn't mention it once in his remarks, apart from to incorrectly claim that it's only because of Brexit that we can have free ports. If that was the case, then we wouldn't have had them many years ago, before they were abolished, when they weren't very effective. But actually, as Keir pointed out, we've got manufacturers now who are really struggling. We've got food producers, shellfish catchers, etc., really, really difficult position right now because of failures with the way that government has dealt with Brexit. And of course, one of our most important industries from the point of view of the UK's overall economic activity is financial and related professional services. And we seem to have a government doing all it can to reduce expectations about the deal that might be reached in its memorandum of understanding, rather than focusing on maintaining that open trade that we need to have with the EU 27 in order to protect jobs across the country.
People have asked questions about the super deduction, the new allowance for capital spending that was introduced. It's by far the biggest giveaway in terms of the next couple of years. Would like to hear your views on whether you think that will be an effective form of stimulus. And then I'd also like to bring in Glenn Armstrong, and then after Glenn, Tom Brooks. Glenn, do you want to ask your question?
Hi there.
Go ahead.
Do you mean the one about the super deduction?
No, I didn't. Did you ask that as well? No, you had a question about windfalls.
Yeah, totally. Thank you very much for doing this, Shadow Chancellor. I just wanted to ask, would Labour still oppose a targeted windfall tax on companies that have profited most during the pandemic?
Thanks, Glenn. And Tom.
Great, wonderful. Enjoyed your comments very much. My question, the immigrant, is about immigration in the budget. You'll forgive me, knowing what I'm like and what I'm interested in. The budget makes several mentions of immigration, including reforms to make it easier for skilled workers, including the investment visa, and nothing on supporting family routes or refugees. And my concern is that the government may weaken requirements around investment commitments beyond the shortest term in the UK, showing a short-term view that may support some parts of the UK, but not all, like such as where I am in the Northeast. So my question is, do you agree that the budget fails to do enough to tackle inequality in this area, and that measures like these risk making such inequalities across the country worse? Thank you.
Great. So,
Great, thanks, Andy. I have to say I'm struggling a little bit to hear some of what you're saying. Sorry, it may just be me actually, but I got those three questions, which is fantastic. Andy, your first question, I did hear the question about the super deduction. Thanks very much for that. I mean, actually, you know, this has been presented by the Conservatives as some kind of incredible, groundbreaking innovation. Now, of course, it is bigger than similar schemes seen in other countries. You know, the Estonian deduction goes up to about 100%, I believe, and this is taking it right up to 130%. It's very, very expensive intervention from government, £25 billion. But actually, you dig into why they are putting this super deduction in place, and it seems to be not because of a desire to be innovative, but because they've had this stop-go approach to corporation tax. Because if they don't put in a big investment incentive, then with that big rise in corporation tax that we're seeing in the future, you could actually see lots and lots of firms putting off investment until the end of that period to write it off against the higher rate of corporation tax. This is the kind of thing that happens when you have a really short-termist approach towards long-term issues. You know, the Conservatives seem to think that cutting back corporation tax rates over the last 10 years, as I said, that this would generate additional investment growth. It hasn't done that. Rather than suddenly screeching into a new approach kind of almost at the last minute and doing so rapidly with the need for this kind of incentive, they should have had a longer term approach to this, one which was much more genuinely based on building investment right across the country. Glenn, your question about taxation, I mean, you're right, we have seen big differences in how companies have benefited during the pandemic. I would say one thing that needs to be done actually is to try not to reinforce that with how different interventions are designed. So Labour-run Wales, for example, I think I might have referred to this briefly in my opening remarks. Labour-run Wales said with their business rates holiday that they wouldn't be, and with their business support measures, that they wouldn't be providing the same support to, for example, the very biggest essential retailers, some of which have been making substantial profits during the crisis, that they wouldn't provide the same support to them as to small businesses in Wales. So they had an explicit carve out there. Now, the UK government has refused to do that. So, you know, we should be designing these measures from the beginning to make sure that they're fairer. The government hasn't done that. Now, there are lots of proposals swirling around currently around, for example, having a turnover tax that's been suggested by government. Obviously, we've got the new system for corporation tax that they're going to be putting into place starting from a couple of years' time. We will look at all of those, of course, carefully. And for me, a really critical issue is how we can deal with that big gulf in the taxation of businesses in our high streets, those based in bricks and mortar, compared to businesses based largely on the internet, where there's a huge difference in the incidence of taxation currently. But of course, it's not just about tax, it's about employment rules a lot of the time as well, where we really need to see change. And, you know, we all hope we will see change after that Uber judgment recently. Tom's question about inequalities, I think, is a really, really important one. And actually, it is very interesting, you know, picking into that issue that Tom mentioned about visas. You look at how, for example, some of the lowest paid workers are treated through the visa system currently, social care workers, where government has said that, you know, for example, they won't have to pay some of the fees up front around obtaining a visa, but they are going to have to pay it into the future. And it's amounting to a really large proportion of their take-home pay. These are people who are really low paid. And to me, that just indicates the priorities that this government has, frankly, that, you know, it's not supporting social care workers. Of course, we need to make sure that we're able to attract those with skills from across the world. We need to make sure that includes, of course, those who are doing some of that really critical work to help our older people, our adults with social care needs, our children with social care needs. And, you know, are the government's proposals really going to be boosting investment and growth right across the country, generating the kinds of jobs that we need to see right across the country? Well, I really don't think that they will be, for the reasons that we were talking about before.
That's brilliant. Anneliese, we're almost out of time. I'm just going to ask one more question from me. Just tell us, if you could cancel one announcement made yesterday, what would it be? And if you could have added in one of your own, what would that have been?
A really good question. I would say, in terms of cancelling one, I would have wanted to be able to cancel the announcements around things like furlough, business rates, VAT, because I, as Chancellor, if I was in that position, would have made those decisions many, many weeks and months earlier, rather than pushing them right back until a budget. So I would have wanted that to have taken place much, much earlier. In terms of adding one in, I mean, I really do think that the low ambitions of the UK around especially those green jobs as the future, that are going to be so important for our environment and indeed for social justice, making sure that they're available across those communities, particularly those experiencing high levels of unemployment now. That would have been my focus if I was Chancellor, and really disappointing that we didn't see that yesterday.
Anneliese, thank you so much for spending the last hour with us, giving your verdict on the budget. Of course, there are plenty more Fabian events coming up over the next few weeks and months through the spring. I think the next one we have with a shadow cabinet minister is coming up in about 3 weeks' time. But in the meantime, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the call the day after the budget, giving your thoughts. Thank you so much to you, Anneliese, and to all our attendees. If you're not a member of the Fabian Society, please do get on our website and join straight after the meeting. Thanks to you all.